that was in itself an invasion. You had not have been aware of the issue of conflict on the continent. During the 1990s, it was almost called the continent of conflict. You had wars in over a dozen countries over a period of time. I tried to list them here. I had, Sudan that had been going on for several decades, both with Darfur and with South Sudan. You had the tragedy in Rwanda, which was triggered by the intervention by the Rwandan Patriotic Front. That was in itself an invasion. You had huge killings and massacres in Burundi. You had the crisis in Somalia when the government of Siad Barre fell, and which we are still dealing with the consequences of today. You have a civil war in Chad. You had the Central African Republic, most recently having its government ousted by a rebel group or an amalgamation of different rebel groups. People may remember that there were two bursts of war between Ethiopia and Eritrea that were at one point the most heavily armed conflicts that were going on in the world. You had the meltdown in Cote d'Ivoire. And then, of course, you had the issues with the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, which was linked with Sudan. And then the longest running one would be the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That leaves out Liberia, Angola, and Sierra Leone. So you can see that Africa has had more than its share, and certainly the African, all of the citizens in those countries have suffered more than enough. What does that conflict mean? Well, it has meant internal displacements in Sudan and South Sudan, 5 to 6 million, 1 to 2 million people during the conflict. Of course, in Rwanda, it's between 500,000 and 1 million. Somalia, the death toll at one point was given as 500,000, but we've just since heard yesterday that humanitarian deaths as a result of the famine, which arguably are linked to the conflict and the lack of stability and security to produce food, resulted in the deaths of about over 230,000 in 2012. The numbers are staggering. There was a reason that the African governments were one of the key constituencies driving this arms trade treaty, because they are dealing with the consequences of it. They still are at the moment. You have the crisis that's going on in Mali, which threatens not only that country but also Chad and the whole Western Maghreb. You have continued insurgencies in Somalia, and of course you have ongoing conflicts, the fighting in the DRC, which seems to ebb and flow and only attracts the attention of the international community when a certain threshold has been reached or when there's some egregious type of violation. So Africa definitely has been waiting for an arms trade treaty and fighting for one, because, as Rachel pointed out, it's not only the death toll, but it's the damage to livelihoods, it's the damage to the security of women who are being raped, it's the use of child soldiers that it's facilitated by these small arms and conventional weapons. It's the displacement of people I've mentioned. UNHCR estimated about 29 million people having been displaced as a result of conflict. And that's just conflict, because the other side of the equation is the role that small arms and conventional weapons are playing in non-conflict situations, the ones that, quote-unquote, don't attract attention, the internal policing activities that result in massacres or in abuses. I had put together with my colleague Felipe a couple of case studies to talk about, just to illustrate the gravity of the situation. I'll start off with Cote d'Ivoire, where the numbers in terms of the death toll start at 1,500, but clearly access to all of the killing sites still is going to probably push that number up. Now, how does a conflict continue or erupt? With weapons. Where did the weapons come from? There are no manufacturing facilities on the continent. These are weapons that are being sold into the continent from outside sources. they're being sold without any qualms about the consequences that those weapons could contribute to, whether the government even has complete command and control over the weapons that it may buy, and certainly without any regard for the cleanup process or the threats that the post-conflict situation continues to have because of the inability to collect the weapons or to actually control the soldiers who and the armed fighters who have those weapons. The weapons in the Côte d'Ivoire conflict ranged from small arms to light weapons to ammunition. They ended up in the hands of human rights abusers, as well as the government armed forces who, if you remember, were fighting against the northern part of the country. There was, in spite of a UN arms embargo, there were huge transfers that were going on, and these were going on from a number of different countries, including France. Then in 2010 and 2011, after the actual fighting had stopped or subsided, but when there were still human rights violations, there were still transfers going on. Amnesty released a report about a month and a half ago documenting the fact that the countries that produced weapons that were selling them to the Ivorian government knew that the abuses were going on and still sold them. The other case study that I'd like to refer to, of course, is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has just been a horrific situation, probably going back to 1995 when the end of the Rwandan genocide resulted in the locating of the former Rwandan government and its armed forces and its militias on the border of the DRC, which then triggered a military action by the new Rwandan government that pushed into the DRC and eventually resulted in the toppling of the Mobutu government. The Congolese security forces had an incredibly bad human rights record. That didn't prevent foreign and Western governments from transferring weapons to them, and it also didn't prevent, unfortunately, weapons being sent to the Rwandan Patriotic Front that were then used in the takeover of the DRC. The case study for the Democratic Republic of the Congo illustrates the issue of control, or the lack of it, of not only the soldiers but also of the actual weapons and stockpiles. Because one of the things that's been consistent is that even when well-intentioned military support or security assistance, even from the United States, is given to the government of Joseph Kabila, the weapons suddenly appear in the hands of the rebels. You may remember the name M23, which was an armed group in the eastern part of the DRC that was fighting to retain control of a particular particular state. The weapons that were being used against the the government's forces were ones that had been previously in the hands of the National Army. So there are clearly issues of responsibility that an arms trade treaty will start to help us address. I will echo what Rachel said, that this is not the panacea and it's not going to solve everything, but at the moment we have nothing. This is a huge step forward. I think I'll skip the Darfur one because I think you're beginning to get the drift. But I want to talk about Rwanda because it was in some ways seminal for Africa and for the global community, because it was one of the first times that people used the term genocide in the modern period. And many people continue to focus on the fact that most of the killings and the genocide in Rwanda were done by machetes. What they don't stop to think about is that rounding up people with machetes wouldn't have happened. It would have been too inefficient. It was guns that basically forced people into locations where they could be easily dispatched by the Interahamwe and by the Rwandan government's armed forces. Where did those guns come from? Well, they came from the Hutu government's supporters, which included France, Egypt, and South Africa. That, I think, is really what we're up against here in terms of how do you change this continent from being something that is being ravaged by conflict to a country, to a continent that can actually devote the resources that Rachel referred to into development, into health, into education, and sort of address the larger issues of poverty. I think as we're looking forward with the Arms Trade Treaty, what are the things that are going to happen, or what are the implications? I think there are four issues that this treaty can help drive, which have been chronic challenges for African governments. Oversight, transparency, human rights, and accountability. If there is indeed a legitimate role for weapons, which we all have to acknowledge there is, then the treaty encourages professional, correct behavior by governments in order to be able to receive weapons, to purchase weapons. The treaty is not only an incredibly big attempt to try to regulate the export and sale from the countries that make these weapons, it's also an effort to try to clean up the recipients by creating standards that Rachel referred to. Because if the lack of consistency now has meant that sure, there's a problem in this country X, but that's really not an issue because I have my protocols about when I sell, to whom I sell, and why I can't sell. Now there actually is going to be a common standard. Now there's going to actually be a requirement to document what you sell and who receives it. Now there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions and to push governments into not making transfers, to abide by the letter of the treaty. It also opens up the possibility of creating internal transparency in these African countries, ideally so that NGOs in those countries, the media in those countries, can ask questions about where the arms are going, how they're being used, who's using them, and whether they are indeed benefiting the national security of the country that's receiving them. On the flip side, the goal, hopefully, for this treaty is to curb or to reduce the illegitimate and irresponsible transfers. People have focused on different parts of this treaty. I think that's understandable, but they're forgetting that no one in the Arms Trade Treaty effort ever. Well, I take that back. Some elements of the Arms Trade Treaty coalition obviously would have wanted to actually see an end to the trade in small arms and conventional weapons. That's fine. That's their business. But there are others who actually understand that countries are always going to have national security needs. They're also always going to have the needs for weapons. But we have to and we can make those weapons be used in a more responsible manner, and their sale and their transfer shouldn't be a free-for-all as it has been up until now. Now, there are a couple of questions, I guess, maybe around some immediate impacts or potential impacts. For example, what happens with Mali? What happens with Somalia? What happens with the government in Somaliland? Or what happens with transfers for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and where you have the need for a professional military, but you also have an armed group that is sponsored by other actors in the region that may not hold to these standards. I think ideally this treaty will tighten up those supply lines and make the governments or the actors that are supporting armed groups have a much bigger challenge in providing those weapons, because they themselves will have to answer to what their purchases or their transfers are resulting in. In other words, if country X receives a sale of weapons, where do those weapons end up? That is the responsibility of that recipient country to track those. And hopefully we can begin to sort of address this bleeding issue, or the leakage, so to speak, of weapons into the wrong hands. it's not going to be easy. Getting the treaty to come into force is the next step. Ratification is the step beyond that here in the United States. And application and implementation in Africa is going to be a challenge. But it has to happen because of the statistics that I was talking about earlier. The continent has to move forward, and if conflict is not something that is addressed effectively, which you need an ATT for, everything else, I think, is put on hold. I'll just end by saying that, Rachel did an amazing amount of work in bringing this treaty to where we are now. I think the treaty actually showed not only that change can happen and can be driven by individuals, but that this large population of people who are impacted by the arms trade can be mobilized. In other words, there was enough pressure that no one was able to walk away from the treaty and drop it. And I think that was incredibly important, and that's something that we should remember even as we face our daily challenges and trying to keep our governments to protect human rights. I'll stop there.